A study of the parables of Jesus. Lesson 16. Parables of lost things. Now this is one of the most famous chapters in the Gospel of Luke, and it deals with 3 lost things. Since it is a whole chapter long and deals with 3 different lost things, I'm going to study them as 2 lessons, and we won't get to the making it part of your life until the second part. This is part 1. Turn to Luke 15, 1 through 31, and we will take our first section will be from Luke 15, 1 through verse 10, the first 10 verses. You found it? Okay, let's read. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Does he not leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. There he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep." I tell you that in the same way, there is more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. Or, suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Does she not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she calls her friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me. I have found my lost coin." In the same way, I tell you, there is rejoicing in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Let's look at the background of these parables. This includes the background of the whole chapter. The literary setting in which Luke places them. These parables are Jesus' response to the constant complaining of the Pharisees and those authorized to interpret the law. Luke summarizes the situation by writing, all the tax collectors and sinners were converging on him to listen to his teaching. Because of this, the Pharisees and those authorized to interpret the law were constantly complaining, saying, "This man is always welcoming tax collectors and sinners. Why, he even eats with them." My translation of Luke 15, verses 1 and 2. Now there's a Palestinian or historical background of these parables. The parable of the lost sheep was based on the well-known practice of the shepherds. The parable of the lost coin was probably based on the custom of a bride's bringing a cash dowry in the form of silver coins with her when she was married. This money was the only thing that remained in her possession throughout her married life. Everything else she had became the property of the husband. This made it especially valuable to her. There is a sense in which all of these parables are about value. What's more valuable, a lost sheep or a lost boy? Which is more valuable, a lost coin or a lost boy? Which is more valuable, a lost prodigal son or an elder brother who was never lost until his decision about his elder brother? Keep that in mind as we go through these parables. The parable of the lost son is based on the almost universal experience of the relationship between fathers and sons. A literary critic once described this small parable as an almost perfect example of a short story, with conflict, with tension, with suspense, and then with a surprise ending. Let's study the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin. And this will be today's lesson. The meaning of the parable as a whole about lost sheep. A shepherd knew his sheep by name, John tells us in John 10:3, and he valued every one of them. Now, one of the commonplaces of Jewish religious teaching from time immemorial was that Israel, the covenant people of God, were God's sheep. The sheep on 1,000 hills are mine, the psalmist sings. The loss of even one of them was the occasion for an intensive search until it was found. They didn't keep sheep for meat to eat. The only sheep that they ever ate was an old, worn-out, tough sheep that had ceased to be productive. They kept them for their wool and their milk. Now let's look at the meaning of this parable. The shepherd is God, and probably in this historical context, Christ himself. The sheep is, or that kind of grates on my grammatical sense, the sheep are Israel. The prolonged search is the work that God is constantly doing, seeking the well-being of his covenant people. From the history of the call into a nation in the Exodus, God unceasingly and untiringly took care of the well-being of his people. He sent judges, he sent prophets, he sent war leaders, he protected them by miracles, he protected them by natural phenomena, he took care of them. His sheep were valuable to him. The time period from Abraham to the sending of the Son to proclaim the presence of his kingdom, God worked for Israel. The joyous celebration is the messianic rejoicing in heaven over even one of God's covenant people who responds to the Son's proclamation and enters the kingdom, the rule of God. Now let's look about making this parable your own. We'll do that when we, in the context of all three, in the next lesson. The parable of the lost coin. Let's look at the meaning of the parable as a whole. As we learned above, a woman's dowry in silver coins was very precious to her. The point Jesus was making is that each and every one of his covenant people is valuable to him. They were not valuable to the Pharisees and those authorized to teach the law. They were not valuable because they made rules and regulations that eliminated people from the covenant people of God without a second thought. They were divisive and exclusive instead of being in harmony and inclusive. Money was scarce and therefore was carefully guarded. If it was lost, it was diligently searched for. Growing up, my parents would tell about an occasion that happened when I was just a pre-toddler. My dad got paid and got an extra bonus for some reason, and after they had paid their week's bills, they had a $20 bill. Now, the $20 bills, they come and go today. But in 1929 and 30, a $20 bill represented 2 weeks' wages. And Mother had it in her hand and had me in her lap. And I guess due to my wiggling around like pre-toddlers do, she let go of it, and they were driving in a touring car. That's a convertible without a top, and the wind took the bill and blew it across the desolate plains close to McCamey, Texas. That was a tragedy. They both sat there in the car and cried. Now that was the woman's attitude toward the value of that one coin. That's God's attitude toward the value of a single covenant member. It was not the Pharisees' attitude. When money was found, it was an occasion for the whole community to rejoice. The meaning of the individual elements. This will be somewhat of a reprise. The woman, and this is one of the radical things that Luke would think of, is God and Christ. Had you ever thought about that? We still have residual results from patriarchal society, and it's hard for us to think that a female might be a symbol of God. It is not hard for God or Jesus to do so. The coins are collectively God's covenant people. The lost coin is one member of the covenant people. The prolonged search is the same as in the previous parable. The joyous celebration is that same messianic rejoicing over the people of God. Making this parable your own will be studied in the context of all three of the parables. Thank you.